Hello everyone, and welcome to my review of the 1986 video game classic Metroid. In this review, I will analyze the game in its entirety. Due to the nature of such a review, story and gameplay will both be revealed towards the audience. If you have yet to play Metroid, I recommend playing it before watching this review, so you may be able to experience it on your own. Consider this a spoiler warning. Metroid doesn't spend a lot of time on its story. In fact, the only glimpse of exposition we get is a short snippet of text during the title screen, which outlines the basic mission objective. The game is set in a futuristic setting, and we play as a bounty hunter called Samus Aran, who is equipped with a highly advanced armor suit and powerful weaponry. Our mission is to infiltrate the space pirate bases on planet Zebes and destroy the highly dangerous lifeform known as Metroid. With a simple press of the start button, we land right in the game. The first screen the player gets to see speaks to the very core of Metroid gameplay. Metroid allows a lot of freedom regarding how the player travels through the world of the game, and this very first screen demonstrates that by giving the player two options: to either go to the right or go to the left. Metroid plays a lot like a classic side-scrolling shooter, and during its release time, it used to be convention for games of that genre to simply have the player run to the right till they cross the finish line and end the level. In Metroid, following this convention will lead the player to a dead end, with the only option of progression being a path that requires a certain item that the player is still missing, forcing them to return to where they came from. Those, however, who choose to go against the convention and instead follow their urge to discover what lies to the left of the starting screen will immediately find said missing item. As soon as the very first screen of the game, the player is already being rewarded to follow his urge to explore. This early into the game, the player's options to explore are rather limited, but this part of the game merely acts as an introduction to the concept of exploration in Metroid. Just a few rooms later, the player will be offered a wide range of options and possible paths to choose from. This adds a whole new layer to the gameplay of Metroid. On the first layer, the player is controlling Samus Aran through dangerous environments, using Samus's jumping abilities to move from platform to platform and weaponry to fight off hostile creatures. This is a very direct layer of gameplay, in which the player's actions have immediate consequences and the game provides immediate feedback towards the player's behavior, such as a failed jump resulting in damage to the player due to having fallen into a pit of lava. On the second layer of gameplay, the player is planning their path through the world of the game. This layer of gameplay provides long-term rewards, such as finding hidden items in an area that wouldn't be considered part of the main path, but also holds potential dangers, such as the player wandering into an area that they are not able to handle with their current equipment. This duality enriches the player's experience immensely, as the player is constantly playing the game on two layers, one focusing on platforming and action, and the other focusing on strategy and exploration. This can be quite motivating too, as whenever the player is progressing through dangerous environments, they are doing so to reach a target that they have set themselves, which lends a certain energy to the game. It also makes for great replayability, as you are allowed to tackle the game differently each time you play. The first item the player gains is the Morph Ball, called Maru-Mari back then, which is Japanese for round ball, accurately describing the Morph Ball's appearance. Its primary function is to let Samus enter tight tunnels, which would otherwise be too small to pass through. The Morph Ball came into being as the developers found themselves unable to draw believable sprites of Samus Aran crawling, and opted to allow Samus to crawl up into a compact ball. This isn't just an effective solution to the problem at hand, but also provides an additional reward to the player, who is most likely going to find a space hunter morphing into a small sphere much more interesting than just having said hunter crawl on all fours. Satisfying upgrades to the player's abilities are important to reward exploration, as a player may be unwilling to further explore the world of Metroid if all they have found so far has disappointed them. The Morph Ball also demonstrates how a developer's or artist's limitations may force or inspire them to become creative and craft interesting solutions. Limitations inspire creativity. The area containing the morph ball shows an elegant way of teaching the player how to use the acquired item. The player needs to climb a few stairs to be able to drop down into a pit in which the morph ball can be found. But said pit doesn't feature stairs that would allow the player to climb back up again. Instead, the player is forced to pick up the morph ball and use it on a small tunnel to exit the pit. As such, the developers can be sure that when a player made it out of that pit, they will know how to use the morph ball and utilize this knowledge to progress further into the game. This is a point where the world of Metroid really opens up for the player. From now on, the route which the player is taking will differ greatly from person to person. The starting area is named Bruns and connects 3 out of 4 other areas, making it function as a sort of overworld. Bruns is directly connected to Turian, which the player must infiltrate and destroy in order to accomplish their mission. However, a gate is locking the player out, and in order to open it, the player must first defeat 2 high-ranking space pirates, known as Kraid and Ridley. These can be found in their respective lairs, the first being called Kraid's hideout and the second being called Ridley's hideout. While Kraid's hideout is directly connected to Bruns, Ridley's hideout lays much deeper inside the planet, and thus forces the player to pass through an area named Norfair first. Bruns itself holds relatively few optional upgrades such as energy tanks or missile containers, and its wildlife is harmless in comparison to later critters. This isn't surprising for an area that functions like an overworld or hub world and also acts as the starting area for the player. Despite that, Bruns holds a handful of important, mandatory items, which means that traveling isn't the only activity the player will do in Bruns, as they will need to explore it for certain upgrades. The eastern part of Bruns features a circular layout, which allows the player to progress in 2 opposing directions. This circular passage, in combination with the fact that the players choose themselves when to search for upgrades in this sector, allows for a non-linear progression even in this first area. Another notable location is the tunnel connecting East Bruns with West Bruns, as this is the only connector between these 2 parts of the map, and the player will most likely find themselves traveling through there quite often, considering that Kraid's hideout and Turian can only be accessed from East Bruns, while Norfair and in extension Ridley's hideout can only be accessed from West Bruns. While the player is allowed to enter Norfair without collecting any upgrades after the morph ball, they will not be able to proceed to the elevator leading towards Ridley's hideout without morph ball bombs. Kraid's hideout too is only accessible via bombs. In order to gain the morph ball bombs, however, the player must find missiles first, as a single door leading to the bombs can only be unlocked by missiles. This sends the player on their first quest in search for items. Afterwards, they will be able to proceed further into the direction of the 2 bosses, but further exploration of Bruns may grant additional items, such as 2 energy tanks, an additional missile container, the long beam, the ice beam, and the warrior suit. To collect some of these, a certain finesse by the player is necessary, and considering how complex the techniques are, which the player must perform to obtain these items, it is unclear to me how many of the items are intended to be collectible so early in the game. It is indeed possible for a skilled player to collect every goodie hidden inside Bruns before even entering a different area, but due to this being quite a challenging task, many players, I assume, are more likely to gain the high jump boots from Norfair first, before backtracking to Bruns and going for all items now, which is much easier as the high jump boots allow Samus to reach these items more easily. This, however, is entirely up to the player. As the maps of Metroid spread 2-dimensionally, the player must often proceed upwards or downwards, resulting in a lot of vertical platforming. The ability to shoot straight up comes in handy here, but it is a shame that Samus is unable to shoot straight down. I'm aware of the technical limitations of video games from the era of Metroid, but I can hardly imagine it being impossible to have Samus fire downwards. Proceeding downwards is most quickly done by simply dropping down the shaft, but without a method of neutralizing enemies that may appear underneath Samus, players are bound to eventually take damage by falling into some of them. This can become frustrating, as the player will most likely try to save their energy for more difficult parts of the game. Trying to speed up the process of descending by dropping down, only to waste time by having to regain energy, can be aggravating. At least the strange bouncy nature of the morph ball is welcomed here, as it is simply fun to bounce from platform to platform like a rubber ball. Another problem with Samus's limited aiming ability is the fact that many low-crawling enemies are able to simply walk underneath Samus's shooting height, as Samus is unable to shoot down, shoot diagonally, or simply kneel. This makes the player entirely unable to attack these foes with either their beam weaponry or missiles, unless their foe starts crawling up a wall or a nearby hole allows the player to stand lower, lining the enemy up with Samus's line of sight. This can quickly become annoying, but really becomes to feel inappropriate in later segments of the game, where the player is able to easily exterminate even the greatest threats, but still cannot shoot a lower critter. At least it gives the morph ball bomb some viability in combat, as these foes can easily be stopped by a row of bombs. The platforming mechanics of Metroid are unimpressive yet solid. They lack a feeling of momentum and weight, and do not feature the physical attributes which made games such as the original Super Mario Bros. So enjoyable. But they are precise, and allow the player to securely navigate the dangerous environments of Zebes. It seems as if the level design takes the lack of movement complexity into account, as jumps never need a running start or a feeling of pacing, but instead simply a secure landing. The final platforming challenge during the self-destruction sequence demonstrates this. So do a few other rooms, which feature creative use of the different blocks featured in Metroid. Most notable example being a room where the player will need to destroy a vertical line of blocks and then climb said blocks once they respawn. Overall, the lack of depth regarding the platforming mechanics of Metroid can be easily forgiven, considering that it is not the sole purpose or focus of the game. For the most part, Winster appears as a rocky, rough series of tunnels, with a few hints of antiquated technology here and there, and the only wildlife being hostile, cave-dwelling insects. In the northeastern area, however, a certain range of plant life can be seen, and the ground it is growing on looks noticeably different too. Even the artificial structures differ from what we have seen before. I find this observation to be important, as the natural assumption one might make is that each level has its own design, but the levels themselves feature no further digression from their themes. The fact that Brinstar does feature visually different areas may itself not sound too exciting, but what I see in there is the implication that Metroid does not wish to present its work in the form of conventional level structure. I have already discussed how Metroid's gameplay tries to break up conventional level structure by providing non-linear progression and rewards for exploration, but the presentation also strives to differ from the norm. The former example is relatively tame, but the way each of the areas interconnect with each other is quite impactful. If you wish to travel from Brinstar to Norfair, you will have to take an elevator. During this short little sequence, which shows Samus riding the elevator, the game will have time to apply a new color sheet and prepare the next area. This happens behind the curtain, though the player's immersion remains untouched. In addition to this technical procedure being hidden from the player, the fact that the player did not need to select a level from an abstract hub or level selection menu, but instead was allowed to use Samus's movement mechanics to manually enter the elevator and start it, made the world of Metroid blend together. This helps to make Zebes feel like a real alien world, instead of a collection of rooms put together to form a level in a video game. Obviously, later games of the Metroid series were far more successful at creating an atmospheric experience, which is not surprising considering that atmosphere is mostly accomplished by presentation, which is highly dependent on the technical capabilities of the console the game is running on. But it is still impressive how moody Metroid can be when walking through the depths of Zebes, and Metroid earned to be complimented for laying the groundworks for later installments of the series. I especially like the atmosphere of the item rooms. When a player first enters such a room, they are most likely coming from Brinstar, which features upbeat music and a natural environment. Once the player enters the item room, however, the music becomes strangely minimalistic and mysterious, and they find themselves surrounded by ancient alien technology. This contrast was so memorable to me that I found myself always excited when entering another item room, as I grew more and more curious about what the next upgrade will be. These rooms seem to act like a build-up before the player can finally get their hands on the item of their desire. The game's composer, Hip Tanake, needs to be complimented at this point. He created a sound whose aesthetics are not unlike those of the game's visuals. While many games on the NES were quite colorful, Metroid mostly was put in front of a black background. Similarly, the music does not blast loudly in an attempt to take advantage of the little capacity the console could provide, but instead consists of much more pointed tunes, set in front of silence. This minimalistic approach made for an alien-sounding experience, greatly contributing to the game's atmosphere. Once a player leaves Bruns behind and enters either Kreit's hideout or Norfair, they will be met with a much greater challenge. Not only do Kreit's hideout, Norfair as well as Whitley's hideout feature much more and better hidden optional items, but also much more dangerous enemies. As such, these areas require the player to get better at both navigating and surviving. The difficulty level scales best if the player chooses to visit Kreit's hideout first, before attempting to clear Ridley's hideout. And considering that the player needs to cross an entire additional sector before even being allowed to enter Ridley's hideout, the game's layout seems to subtly suggest that the player may want to visit Kreit's hideout first. Unfortunately, independent of the player's choice, the greater difficulty highlights one of Metroid's biggest flaws, which lays within the fact that Samus's health is not replenished if a player dies. Many games during the era of Metroid simply reset if a player lost the game, but such an approach would be inappropriate for a title like Metroid, which strives to provide the player with a greater sense of progression. Instead, the player will only lose their current position, but not their current equipment, as they respawn at the last elevator they have used. Considering that Metroid is a lot about navigating unknown environments, the threat of losing your current position is enough to make enemies and hazards appear dangerous, and as such, losing your entire health is met with an appropriate response by the game, punishing the player for being too careless by taking them back a few steps. However, during this process, the game does not replenish Samus's health, leaving the player at only 30 health points. Considering that the player was just on their way through an environment that was dangerous enough to kill them, it is unlikely that they would want to return there with such low health. Unfortunately though, the only method of completely refilling health is by collecting an energy tank, which will most likely not be possible in such a situation, considering how little energy tanks the game features and how scattered they are. While navigating Brinstar usually led to the player slowly gaining health, as the enemies of Brinstar often drop more health than they can take away from the player, the same cannot be said for other areas of the game, where instead a player may lose health by further progression. This forces the player to search for an area with relatively harmless critters and repeatedly kill them for health drops. If a player has 4 energy tanks while losing the game, they will have to replenish a total of 370 health points before their energy has been completely refilled. Considering that lower enemies can only drop small health pickups, which refill 5 health points, the player will need to kill at least 74 enemies. If half of the enemy drops happen to be missiles, they will have to kill at least 148 enemies. And this is already the best case scenario. If only half of the enemies provide any drops at all, the player will need to kill 296 enemies. And of course will not be allowed to take any damage during any of this. This is not a proper punishment to the player for losing a life. Instead of just having to repeat a few of their steps, players are forced to search for a safe room, featuring respawning enemies, and then grind for health for a few minutes, which brings the entire momentum of the game to a halt. This alone is frustrating, but the process of grinding itself is so unengaging, slow and boring that I found myself losing all motivation to continue playing after losing a life. I simply forced myself through it so that I could continue. While doing so, I even considered restarting the entire game, as I thought that repeating my previous accomplishments would at least feel more engaging than grinding, and would have me less bored as I regain my health naturally while searching through Brinstar once more. The fact that I would rather replay a section that I just finished instead of discovering something new highlights how aggravating the experience of dying in Metroid can be, and I think that this problem is Metroid's biggest flaw. This, unfortunately, is not the only flaw present in Metroid. Another flaw comes apparent too in Krite's hideout, or at least to all players who decide to explore the northeastern part of Krite's hideout. This sector features 15 rooms forming 3 floors and a connecting vertical shaft. However, this sector neither leads anywhere, nor does it feature any items. This entire sector is a giant dead end, and as such does not reward, but instead punish exploration, which stands in opposition to Metroid's core gameplay. Additionally, Metroid sometimes even punishes player observation. Underneath the ice beam in Bruns lays a hidden tunnel, which itself does not hold anything of interest, but allows the player to advance far enough to see a vertical shaft, similar to the one they had to drop down to find the ice beam. A clever player will not only find this observation, but also be able to see a pattern, and thus follow a new path. However, doing so will not grant them anything, as the visible vertical shaft does not lead anywhere and does not feature any items. One could argue this makes the world more organic and exploration more challenging, but it is mostly just discouraging and irritating to follow paths and search every nook and cranny, only to find that there has never been a secret to begin with. To me, there's no good reason why some of these hollow areas exist, and I suppose the developers may actually agree with me, as all these areas do actually contain something of value in the much later released remake titled Metroid Zero Mission, which was created by the same development team as the original. However, it is of course possible that these repeated rooms are merely due to technical limitations. Apart from greater issues becoming apparent in Krite's hideout, I do not have a problem with the area itself. In fact, I believe that Krite's hideout is well crafted. The blocks that construct Krite's hideout look much more like construction blocks instead of natural rock formations, like those in Bruns, and in combination with the new, eerie music, Krite's hideout feels atmospherically distinct from previous areas. Krite himself is hidden deep inside of his hideout, and thus requires the player to dig deep into the planet to locate him. In order to find Krite, the player will need to uncover a fake pool of lava and find a hidden hole in the floor of a mostly unsuspicious room. Twice. Additionally, a fake Krite is put into the player's way in between the first time and the second time they need to find a hidden hole. As such, those who abandon their eagerness to explore once they believe to have Krite taken down may need to return here later to find the real Krite, after they have found that they eliminated the wrong target. I personally enjoy this approach, but some may see it as a cheap trick to fool the player, which is a fair argument, considering that there's nothing in-game which hints at the first Krite being fake, especially if a player chooses to hand Krite first and as a result is unable to use Ridley as a reference to compare how a Metroid boss would play out. Considering that Metroid's combat is relatively shallow in comparison to later games of the series, it is not surprising that the boss fight against Krite is not all too complex. It basically tests the player's ability to dodge a high amount of projectiles while outdamaging their opponent. Alternatively, the player can use Samus's Morph Ball form to roll into the enemy and lay bombs as quickly as possible. This will result in the player taking a huge amount of damage, but if they come equipped with enough energy, they should be able to outlive their opponent. It is nice to have an alternate strategy for this fight, even though I am unsure whether this method was intended by the developers. It is also nice that in this boss room lies a hidden energy tank. I assume that most players will not easily guess a hidden item to be located inside a boss chamber. Defeating Krite grants the player 70 missiles, which is some sort of turnaround for this weapon. So far, missiles have been quite precious, as a lack of missiles could easily get the player stuck at the next red door, causing most players to have a keen eye on their ammunition. Now, however, it is unlikely a player will run out of missiles, and thus the player can be much more reckless with them. Finally, the missiles become viable as a weapon too, and not only as a tool to unlock certain doors. Unfortunately, however, this has a negative impact of the satisfaction a player feels when they collect a missile container, as now these containers seem like a much lesser reward. In fact, over 50% of the maximum amount of missiles a player can obtain during Metroid are mandatory, and I believe that gathering missile containers may have been more rewarding is the maximum difference between a player who chooses to collect very little optional upgrades and a player who chooses to collect as many optional upgrades as possible would have been greater. That being said, collecting missiles is not without value, as the very last section of the game requires a huge amount of ammunition. Once Sprite has been defeated, the player can make their way to the next boss, Ridley. To enter Ridley's hideout, however, Norfair must be crossed first. Norfair is more than a mere obstacle though, as it does not only include the highest amount of optional items, but also several upgrades such as the screw attack or high jump boots. It is notable that Norfair and Bruns are the only two sectors which include such upgrades. Due to these factors, exploring Norfair can be highly rewarding and plays more like Bruns than either of the two hideouts, as you are not trying to locate your target, but instead search for vital upgrades and the next elevator. Dependent on the player's route through the planet Zebes, the player may also find themselves backtracking between these two sectors continuously. At many times, exploring Norfair can feel like the real highlight of the game. It also successfully distinguishes itself atmospherically from previous environments, as it appears as a volcano-like area intertwined with apparently organic, maybe even living material. Its music is also less upbeat than Bruns and less melodic than Kraid's, making it feel more in tone with the alien nature of the secret item room's music. Norfair also contains the Wave Beam, which has a high damage output but lacks the freezing ability of the Ice Beam. Due to the lack of this ability, the Wave Beam cannot be considered a straight upgrade from the Ice Beam, as players cannot use enemies as platforms with the Wave Beam anymore. In Metroid, only the Long Beam stacks its effect onto other beams, while Wave Beam and Ice Beam replace each other. As the Ice Beam is necessary to kill Metroids in Turian, the last part of the game, the player needs to recollect the Ice Beam after defeating Ridley and before striving towards the end of the game. This is probably the reason why an easily available Ice Beam can be found in Bruns, quite close to the entry gate of Turian. While this Ice Beam can be collected early, doing so requires a difficult technique. This Ice Beam can only be collected easily once the player gains the high jump boots from Norfair, which allows Samus to make greater jumps. The developers most likely intended the player to collect the Wave Beam and clear Ridley with it, and return to Bruns with the high jump boots to regain their Ice Beam and approach Turian. All this can easily be skipped, however, if the player simply decides not to fight the Metroids in Turian, which is a problematic option that I will discuss later when talking about Turian itself. Unlike previous areas, Norfair does not punish the player for exploring the area in its entirety, as almost every path leads to a discovery, sometimes several missile containers in a row, which can feel highly satisfying. Additionally, pattern recognition is this time rewarded. Finding a secret passage and repeating the process now often holds fruition. Once more, I feel like Metroid is at the top of its game when it comes to Norfair. Underneath Norfair lays Ridley's hideout, and the mere fact that it lays deeper than any other place the player has visited so far is enough to make Ridley's hideout feel threatening and alienating. Combine that with the highest amount of dangerous enemies in the game and a villainous music scoring the scene, and the player is being put into the right mood to face the next boss. It is not just the area's presentation which makes Ridley's hideout quite dreadful, but also the area's layout. The area features several traps where the player may fall through a block that appeared as if Samus could have simply walked across it. This usually leads to a long fall down a vertical shaft, which the player cannot climb back up, forcing them to search for a different route and most likely losing any sense of orientation in the process. The game can be quite taunting during these portions too, as often welcoming items lure the player towards such traps. Not only will the player have to plan a new route on the search for Ridley, but also will they now be plagued by the knowledge of a missed item, which is probably still taunting them. Returning to such an item and feeling the fear of maybe stepping into the trap again is stressful, yet utterly enjoyable. The final kicker is the satisfaction of finally getting to said item and safely collecting it. Ridley himself is well hidden, and finding him can be quite a feat. Fighting him though, as I found, is not very exciting. It seems as if firing missiles as fast as possible is the best and maybe only option there is. And ever since the massive missile upgrade from Kraid, this has become easily affordable. Attacking Ridley with the screw attack is viable too, but only makes the fight even easier. Before we continue to the next part of the game, I find this to be a good time to discuss the upgrades featured in Metroid, as the player will have most, if not all of these by now. As mentioned earlier, satisfying upgrades are important to reward exploration, and I have already explained why I find the Morph Ball to be a success in this regard. The Morph Ball bombs are not nearly as interesting, but quite useful. Their main function is to open small tunnels, allowing Samus to roll through. They can also be used in combat, either to attack low-crawling critters or even to attack Krite. The long beam is not too exciting, but makes using Samus' beam weapon much more safe and secure, and thus makes Samus more powerful as a result, which is satisfying enough, especially when facing flying foes such as Shriek Bats, which now can easily be picked off before they get a chance to attack. The Ice Beam is not just an effective weapon, as it allows you to instantly immobilize enemies by freezing them, but also a great tool for platforming, as a frozen enemy can be used as a platform. As such, the Ice Beam appeals to both layers of gameplay, as it does enhance Samus' combat capabilities, as well as Samus' navigation options. Creating ice platforms by freezing life forms is also much more interesting than just having a blue door that can only be unlocked by the Ice Beam. The Wave Beam is powerful and has an interesting look to it, but it's just a situational affair. This is not necessarily bad, as optional content makes exploration more rewarding, but the Ice Beam almost always seems like the better option. The high jump boots allow Samus to jump to greater heights and work perfectly with the many vertical shafts featured in Metroid. They also make lava and acid pits less dangerous, as the player now can climb out of them more easily if they happen to fall into one of them. The screw attack is visually intriguing, as Samus spins quickly through the air, shredding every enemy that makes contact with the attack. This makes a simple jump into a weapon, and means that Samus can kill by simply progressing through the environment. Considering how far the player may have to travel in order to play through Metroid, this makes for a powerful tool. It also makes grinding for health much less painful, and can act as a shield if a player decides not to engage with any of the enemies and simply walk through the area. The Warrior suit does not defend Samus from heat like it does in later installments of the Metroid series, but simply protects Samus from damage. Once Samus wears the Warrior suit, only half the amount of damage will be inflicted in comparison to the damage Samus would have taken wearing the standard power suit. This makes survival in Metroid much more manageable, especially if the Warrior suit is collected early. As such, the Warrior suit provides a huge reward for players who work hard to get it early. With all these quite different and interesting weapons and abilities, I can say that I am quite happy with the selection of upgrades Metroid has to offer. The only complaint I have is that many of these upgrades are collected early, so that only a few upgrades remain, which will make the player feel gaining power and strength towards the end of the game. Considering how open the progression of Metroid is structured, this pacing issue may not be infringing on every player's enjoyment, as it may simply not appeal to everyone, as some players may collect some more powerful upgrades only nearing the end of the game. Once a player has defeated both space pirate leaders, they will be able to cross the gate to Turian, which is the last sector of the game. This sector is composed of a giant mechanical research laboratory, used by the space pirates to breed Metroids. As such, Turian is made entirely of mechanical elements. While Turian features turrets shooting circular projectiles at Samus, as well as dangerous acid pits, the biggest threat stems from the Metroids themselves, who are able to latch onto Samus and quickly inflict huge amounts of damage. Once they latch onto Samus, they can only be shaken off using several bombs in Morph Ball form, while strafing away from the bomb explosion, making the player feel as if they were to struggle with Samus to get rid of the attacker, which can be quite panic-inducing. Additionally, Metroids require the Ice Beam, as they need to be frozen to be vulnerable, as well as 5 missiles to be eliminated. If the player fails to strike with 5 missiles before the Metroid unfreezes, they will need to repeat the process. This makes Metroids as intimidating as they deserve to be, considering that they are the main threat which has set Samus' mission into motion, and makes Turian the most stressful and dreadful area of the entire game. This is of importance, as Turian is supposed to be the dramatic finish to the game. Due to being designed to act as the dramatic finish, Turian is entirely linear. It does not feature any sort of exploration, alternative paths or optional items, and is instead a simple endurance test for the player, and a reward to those who went the extra mile to snatch a few more collectibles. I find this final challenge to be problematic, as I can easily imagine some players expecting Turian to be the biggest maze of the entire game, which brings the exploration aspect of Metroid to new heights and tops every previous area. I personally enjoy the idea of a final challenge like Turian to close out the game, but there's no denying that those players who expected something more in line with the overall structure of Metroid must have been greatly disappointed once they reached Turian and found nothing but a linear corridor. Disappointment obviously makes for a rather weak ending. Most players will consider the advanced supercomputer named Mother Brain at the end of Turian to be the final boss. But taking into account how the linearity of Turian stands in opposition to the rest of the game's structure and how difficult combat against Metroids can become, I consider the entirety of Turian to be the final boss of Metroid. I already mentioned that I enjoy the idea of a final conclusion like Turian, and if you see the entirety of Turian as a sort of last boss fight, this idea becomes even more appealing. Yet despite that, I actually dislike Turian. In fact, I consider Turian to be a failure. As said before, Turian mainly works as an endurance test, asking if the player can conserve enough of their resources while on their way through the research lab to face and defeat Mother Brain, and thus accomplish the mission. The conservation of these resources is made difficult by the highly dangerous Metroids, who when fought will cost energy and ammunition. The key question, though, is why anyone would want to fight Metroids. Once the player decides to simply run past any Metroids they meet, they will find that facing Mother Brain becomes much easier, as they will have almost all of their resources still with them. Even if the player is capable of killing Metroids without losing any energy, the fact that Metroids consume missiles makes engaging them entirely unrewarding and in fact pointless. Even if the player is lucky enough to not only lose any energy to Metroids, but also to have lucky missile drops which restock their entire ammunition, that player will only reach the same situation as a player who simply chose to ignore any Metroids. Engaging Metroids is always a suboptimal and risky choice. Once more I believe that the developers would agree with me here, as the remake Metroid Zero Mission fixes this problem by forcing the player to engage and defeat every Metroid in Turian. In the original game though, there is no incentive to do so, especially considering that the later destruction of Turian kills all Metroids anyway, so that even from a story standpoint there is no reason to fight Metroids, as Samus will accomplish the mission anyway. This can lead to two different situations. The first situation has the player being unable to defeat Mother Brain on the first try, and thus has them travel through Turian once more. Considering that, if the player ignores any Metroids, Turian does not feature any challenge at all, this process will simply be unengaging and boring. And being forced to perform an unengaging and boring task before being allowed to retry your luck with Mother Brain can only lead to frustration, similar to Metroid's problem regarding grinding for health. The second situation has the player use the advantage of ignoring any Metroids to kill Mother Brain on the first try, which will most likely be much too easy to provide any satisfying conclusion. Seeing how I consider the entirety of Turian to be a single boss fight, I must unfortunately say that Turian is a very disappointing and senseless boss fight, which is why I see Turian as a complete failure. The fact that Mother Brain's fight itself is not all that fun either, but instead finicky and often frustrating due to an overexposure to hazardous projectiles and the game's speed starting to lag harshly due to the high amount of sprites being drawn, also does not help. At least Mother Brain and her chamber are visually quite iconic and have a nice vibe to them. Fortunately, however, there's one element of Turian that I really do like, which is the self-destruction sequence after Mother Brain has been defeated. A timer will be set, and the player will be forced to quickly ascend through a vertical shaft, which features only tiny platforms to climb, and thus becomes one of Metroid's most difficult platforming challenges. This is an odd timing for an action sequence of a video game of Metroid's era, considering that most games simply presented the ending screen once the last boss has been vaporized. And I suppose that most players must have been quite surprised by this. Calling this additional challenge a mere surprise is an understatement though, as the tough platforming with the ticking clock put over it becomes quite unnerving. The music is a large factor too, as the tune that is playing during this escape sequence is simply thrilling and elevates an already successful surprise into a panic-inducing experience. The only flaw I find during this sequence is the fact that the music sometimes sounds quite heroic, as I would have preferred it to only resonate on the pressure-inducing parts of the track. But this is merely nitpicking. Once more, Metroid is innovative and crafts something valuable. I personally enjoy the escape sequence so much that it saves the game's conclusion for me, despite the rest of Turian being a disappointment. Once the player successfully escaped from Turian, the story wraps up as quickly as it has begun during the title screen, with a short snippet of text informing the player that the mission has been accomplished. Yet the game holds one more little treat for the player. So far, Samus Aran has only been seen in full body armor suit, clouding the true identity of this brave bounty hunter. But now that we finally get to the end of the game, Samus will climb out of the highly advanced power suit and reveal the face behind the visor, which happens to belong to a young woman. During this review, I never referred to Samus with sex-bound attributes, so if you did not know about our protagonist's sex before watching this review, you may be surprised by this revelation. The point of me not referring to Samus in any way that could have given away her sex is that the developers too never pointed out Samus' sex during the course of the game, and an effort was made not to spoil the surprise by mentioning Samus' sex in guides or in advertisements. Another reason why I never mentioned Samus' sex was because it has no impact on Metroid's gameplay or story. Yet the very fact that we have a female protagonist in a genre which usually features male heroes, without actually drawing attention towards that fact, has made Samus into an icon for female emancipation in modern media for many people. I personally doubt this was the true intention of the developers, who, as I would guess, have most likely simply chosen Samus to be a woman because Ellen Ripley, protagonist of the Alien film franchise, which had a huge influence on Metroid, was a woman too. But I still think it earned to be mentioned here, especially considering that this iconic state of Samus Aran has mostly been kept intact to this very day. The ending is also notable for rewarding the player for swift playing, as those players who finish the game quickly will get to see Samus uncover more of her true form. Due to this, Metroid is often said to be the first game featuring multiple endings, and while this is certainly interesting from a historical standpoint regarding the culture of video games, I do not think that Metroid utilizes its different endings to accomplish what most players nowadays would expect from a game with multiple endings. Most players will probably associate multiple endings with the ability to influence the story's outcome, which is not possible in Metroid, as the endings only differ in presentation. Instead, I think that these multiple endings are important to the history of speedrunning, the competition to win a game as quickly as possible, which has at least partially been kickstarted by the Metroid series. Later games display a much greater ability to be used for speedrunning, but with this clever little ending, the original Metroid started it all. Whenever I read someone asking which Metroid title would be a good introduction for newcomers to the series, I see veterans suggesting to skip the original Metroid, as it supposedly has not aged well. As the oldest game in the series, the original Metroid obviously is technically inferior to its own descendants, but I still think that this formulation belittles Metroid and its accomplishments. To me, the game has aged gracefully, as its core concept, the two-layered gameplay of exploration and action, is still intriguing even in modern times. The interconnected world of planet Zebes and the resulting atmosphere only punctuate Metroid's qualities. That is not to say that the game is flawless, but I think that Metroid's flaws have not simply come apparent, but at times making players more sensitive for weak game design, or the progress of the medium allowing modern games to iron out certain flaws, making older games pale in comparison. But instead I believe that Metroid's missteps have always been flaws. Even in 1987, forcing players to slowly regain health by grinding lower enemies for what feels like an eternity is simply unacceptable and a very bad design choice. So is punishing players for their observation skills and urge to explore, or presenting a mostly disappointing ending. Yet, in its core, Metroid's design has always been, and still is, fascinating, and I recommend Metroid to anyone who feels able to tackle an old-school NES title, which may be over-demanding and unforgiving at times, but still has plenty to offer and lots of rewards for players who pull through.